Billions of people pray. They sit with their grief, their fear, their gratitude, and they direct it all towards something which they believe is truly listening. A belief in a God who is listening is what classical theology is based upon. But what if the God described by classical theology is, by definition, unable to listen at all? Hey guys, I'm Liv. Welcome back to Liv's Thoughts. We are so freaking back, guys. It's awesome. I want to talk about my final research paper that I did for my philosophy of religion class, where my title of the paper was A God Who Cannot Hear. And this idea that the God described in theology is classical theology, is religiously inadequate to the God that they present, if you will. Hey y'all, Editing Liv here. I just want to add a quick disclaimer before we really jump into the video. This is the first time I've scripted a video, okay? And along with scripting a video, I didn't realize that you're not supposed to really just read off the script as you're filming. You know, it should be a little more natural. We live and we learn. The next videos will be better, but I really wanted to make sure I am saying everything I needed to say. I'm trying to add pictures, but there's not a lot of pictures I can add for this video, so forgive me for the clearly reading a script in this video. Okay, enjoy. So classical theism, which is basically the theological backbone of Christian mainstream thinking, as well as like Islam and Judaism as well, has this very specific idea of what God is, and it all came from this one philosopher named Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. And he stated that than which nothing greater can possibly, I just added a word in there, nothing greater that can be conceived. So basically, God is this perfect being in your mind that nothing greater can be conceived. We get the point. Okay, cool. So this seems pretty reasonable so far, but then the logic just keeps going and it goes to some pretty wild places, if you will. If God is perfectly perfect, then God cannot change, because change means either getting better, which means you actually weren't perfect before, or getting worse, which obviously would be a problem. So God has to be completely unchanging. Immutable is the correct word we would use for this. Now, if God cannot change, cannot be affected by anything, because being affected by something means it changed you. So if your prayer actually could move God, or your suffering would actually reach God, that means God would be dependent on you in some way. And that breaks the whole perfect or complete sort of thing. So God is impassible, which just means God is untouchable. And then on top of this, if God is outside of change, then God has to be outside of time, because time is just a sequence before and after. And if God experienced moments one at a time like we do, then God would be limited by those moments. So God is atemporal, timeless. And look, I'm not going to pretend like the logic doesn't hold with what he's saying. Each step follows from the last. And these were not dumb people. Aquinas built his whole theology on this. It's coherent. But the problem is what it rules out. Okay, so let's think about what this idea of timeless really means. A God outside of time does not experience the now. There is no before, there is no after in God's existence. Everything, every moment, everything, every prayer ever spoken, everything that will ever happen is just present. Everything, anywhere, all at once, just like the movie. It is the eternal now, which sounds kind of beautiful and mystic, right? Like, it is interesting to think about until you think about it for 5 seconds in the context of a prayer. Because when you pray, you're doing something in time. You're saying something now and you're asking something to change later because of this. That is what the whole structure of asking something is. But with a timeless God, your prayer doesn't get received after you say it. There's no after. Your 2 a.m. tearful prayer is just eternally co-present with every other prayer and every other moment ever. It is not something that God heard and responded. It's just there forever alongside everything else. What does it mean when you ask a timeless being for something to change? The logic of I say this and then something happens just simply doesn't really apply. Now we stack impassibility on top of that. God can literally not be affected by anything. Then your pain doesn't reach God at all. Not even a little. A mom watching her kid die. People running from violence. Someone slowly being crushed by poverty. According to this version of God, none of that touches God in literally any way. Classical theologians aren't oblivious to how that sounds. Their answer is basically God still acts through providence. God orders everything towards good. God's love is expressed how reality is structured and not in the feelings of things about you specifically in that situation. Okay, well, that's fine. That's something. And I'm not trying to strawman this argument, but that is completely different from a God that is all over the scripture we read. Like, for example, the God of Exodus. He hears the people cry out for help from being enslaved. He physically comes down and does something about it. He has a plan. He hears it and then does something about it, you know? There's this philosopher, Nicholas Wolterstorff, excuse me, forgive me. He's very cool, by the way. Very much enjoyed reading his work. Who basically argued that classical theology took the biblical God and ran it through a Greek philosophical filter that biblical authors never signed up for. The biblical God changes his mind. He grieves, he gets angry, he relents. That is just what the text says. And then when classical theologians are confronted with this relational language, they go, oh, that's just accommodation. Metaphors, simplified language for our human minds that can't grasp what God is really like. But if all of this is a metaphor, then what are we actually praying for? Who are we actually praying to, you know? Now, if we look at the Muslim, Judeo, Christian versions of praying, they're all different. They're all grounded in different practices, but they all have the same reasoning, placing themselves at the foot of God, begging for mercy, begging for something to come true. All of these assume that God is there, present, receiving something, capable of physically responding. A timeless, impassible God cannot do that. Not in any way that those words normally mean. And I think there is a thing that kind of does get glossed over. A God who can't be affected isn't a lesser version of the relational God. It's just an entirely different entity. And you might find it philosophically interesting, awe inspiring to think about, but you can't actually have a relationship with it, not in the real sense of how we know a relationship to be. So there are two main ones that take this problem pretty seriously. Open theism says that God is temporal. God exists in time with us and is a part of the future, and a part of the future is genuinely open to change, even to God to change because it hasn't happened yet, which means God has a chance to listen, has a chance to respond, and can actually be affected by the things that happen. The trade off then is that God has exhaustive foreknowledge of the future, which freaks a lot of classic theists out. Not having a determined future kind of ruins a lot of what classical Christianity claims about God. Determinism is fucked, like truly fucked. Process theology claims that God has two sides, an eternal nature and what they call consequent nature, that is genuinely shaped by what happens in the world. So God is affected by our reality. God is the kind that grows alongside with us and moves with us. The trade off is, though, that this limits divine omnipotence, and classical theologians don't really like that one. And look, both of these give a lot of stuff up in God's divine nature, and I'm not going to pretend like they don't. And classical theists are right that there are trade-off costs here. But a God who is transcendent in the word relationship becomes meaningless. It is effectively an absent God. A God who cannot hear is, practically speaking, a God who is not there, who is, in another way of putting it, an absent God. But an absent God is religiously inadequate to our definition of what God is. And here's where I land on this. Classical theology is genuinely impressive. The arguments are tight, the systems hold together. It's withstood time for a very fucking long time. And wanting to protect the idea of divine transcendence isn't wrong. These are serious thinkers doing serious freaking work. But in the process of building a God that was perfectly unchanging and perfectly complete, millions of people that they can't really make sense of. Prayer isn't just talking to yourself. It's not therapy with a ceiling. It's not just vibes. It assumes that there's something real on the other end, something present, something that receives, something that can fully respond. The God of classical theism isn't that. And I think that if we're honest about it, we're left with genuinely an uncomfortable question. Do we change what we think about prayer, or do we change how we think about God? And I don't have a clear answer on that, but I think it's a question genuinely worth sitting with. Was pretty much my entire paper on the religious inadequacies of God, coming from a theological standpoint of everything I've learned in my philosophy of religion class. I think that this is a topic I want to seriously dive deeper into the more that I study. And this is kind of what I'm aiming for when I say, wow, I really, really want to go get my PhD. This is the type of research I want to do because I have so many more thoughts on just what I talked about today. And although I don't know if you guys could tell, I read off a script today. I wrote a script for this whole thing of just based on my whole article. And if you want to read my whole article, it will be linked below in my Substack per usual. Go ahead and look it up. It's really fun. It's really cool. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on my own writing. Yeah, it's so fascinating to me, this like kind of unheard, not unheard, but like unanswering idea of God, because I don't think God answers in the way that we proclaim him to answer. And I don't think that God listens in the way that we are comfortable with saying he listens. And I think that this is a big comfort thing. And I recognize this with the conversations I have with deeply religious people, is like, it's an uncomfortable thing to say, I don't think you are right about what you believe God to be. But I think that this is like, we could take better steps and further steps to make God more unifying in a way. Like, there's a reason that I find this like work so important, and like these topics so important, because I think that unity and this idea of we are all one in Buddhism and Hinduism, that they really get right, that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism lack of this idea of oneness. I think that there's an idea of chosenness in the more Western traditions of religion, where in Eastern philosophies of religion, especially, there's no chosen, you just are. And I admire that, whereas Western philosophies of religion are, you can choose to be picked or you can choose to get fucked, you know? It's very interesting. But if you have any objections to the things I talked about today, of course, as always, please feel free to drop them below. If not, just let me know what you liked about this video. I definitely will be scripting more videos. I think that kind of keeps me on track, keeps me pacing out, better idea of what I'm going to say. So I think that's really fun. But peace, love, and happiness. And I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.